And I think we're going to see a similar depreciation, devaluation, however you want to define it, of the dollar in the next leg of this journey, because I think the next thing that's going to happen.
Step into the tumultuous realm of finance, where Peter Schiff warns of a crisis looming larger than 2008. With banks on shaky ground and the FDIC's coffers running dry, depositors face a stark choice: risk losing it all or watch their savings dwindle to dust. Welcome to a world where the stakes are high and the future of your money hangs by a thread. Now let's listen to Peter Schiff again and continue watching this video until the very end.
Yeah, well, first of all, I started publicly advocating for people to buy gold and silver in the late 1990s. And when I did that, gold was under $400 an ounce. And now it's over $2,000 an ounce. So a lot of people think, well, gold hasn't gone anywhere. It actually has gone up quite a bit if you trace the beginning of the bull market to around 2001. So over the past 20 years, it's gone up quite a bit. Now, of course, gold went up from under 400 to almost 2,000 in 2011. So over that last 10 years or so, or 12 years, gold hasn't made much headway. It's kind of digested those gains, consolidated, and I think it's built a great base, and it's headed for another leg higher, much higher. I think the order of magnitude will be similar to what we had in the 1970s with gold, where gold went from $35 an ounce in the late 60s to over $800 in the early 80s. So that's the type of move that I expect. And what happened in the 70s was we went off the gold standard in 1971 because we ran big deficits, printed too much money, was the war on poverty, the Great Society, Vietnam, going to the moon, Kennedy, Johnson era, Nixon, and we just were this, profligate. I mean, not by today's standards. I mean, we were pretty conservative if you want to compare it to modern day, but we could no longer stay on the gold standard because the gold standard was incompatible with this big government. I mean, gold would have reined in excess government spending. And so we went off the gold standard rather than cutting government spending and balancing the books. We took the easy way out. And then, the world devalued the dollar because it was no longer backed by anything. And so the dollar lost a tremendous amount of purchasing power. That's why you needed 800 to buy an ounce of gold. But it was, other currencies, the yen, you used to get 360 yen for the dollar, and it went down to like maybe 150 at that time. You used to buy more than 4 Deutschmarks for the dollar. The dollar went down about 1.5. Oil was $3 a barrel in 1970. It was $30 a barrel in 1980. It wasn't that oil got more expensive. It's just that the dollar lost value. We just printed a lot of dollars, and so you needed more dollars to buy oil. And the average American's paycheck was so diminished by the inflation tax. That's the real reason that you had a huge influx of married women into the workforce, because in the 1960s, very few married women worked. Their husbands supported them. But by the 1980s, you had a lot of women that were working because their husbands' paychecks didn't go far enough because the money lost a lot of value. Prices went up. And I think we're going to see a similar depreciation, devaluation, however you want to define it, of the dollar in the next leg of this journey, because I think the next thing that's going to happen, we went off the gold standard in 1971. The next thing that's going to happen is the world is going to go off the dollar standard. And, even though we went off the gold standard, the dollar remained the reserve currency, even though it wasn't backed by anything anymore. And that provided Americans with a gigantic subsidy because we could just print money and then buy stuff with it without having to make anything, because we could take the money we printed and exchange it for the goods that people made in other countries using, factories and labor and land and all these resources. We didn't have to use any resources. We just conjured money into thin air and we got all this stuff. And Americans didn't have to save. We could just spend everything we earned, while the rest of the world, did all the heavy lifting. So we've had this giant subsidy that has been propping up the economy. And what I've been warning about, even going back to the Greenspan era, was that we were going to lose this privilege because of the profligacy. I was a big critic of Alan Greenspan's tenure going back to 1987. I remember I wrote him letters. I still have the letters I sent him. He answered me. I was just out of college. But I didn't like his response to the 1987 stock market crash. And I criticized him for what he did, and he defended it to me. But that was the beginning. And then he kept repeating those mistakes up until the policies that inflated the housing bubble that he enacted in 2001. And then he passed the baton to Bernanke, and the bubble popped on his watch, 2007, 2008. But those monetary mistakes have continued under Yellen and now under Powell. And in the meantime, the national debt has gone from, I don't know, maybe it was a 2 or 3 trillion. I forget where it was when I wrote that letter to Greenspan. I know it was 1 trillion in 1980 when Reagan came in. But now the national debt is 34 trillion. But it's rising by $1.25 trillion. I mean, even though the official budget deficits are about 2 trillion, which is still enormous, if you actually look at the national debt, every quarter it goes up by $1 trillion. So the government's borrowing $4 trillion. Yeah, well, we would have had a worse financial crisis than 2008 had the Fed not come to the rescue of those banks. But that does not mean that they've fixed the problem. They haven't. They just bought some time while the problem got worse. But the banking sector, again, is much sicker than it was in 2008 when we bailed them all out. And all the banks that were too big to fail in 2008 are much bigger now. And so when they fail this time, it's going to be even worse. The banking system was actually far sounder in 1929. When we had the Great Depression, we didn't have any government insurance on bank deposits. In all of the 1930s, only about 2% of all the bank deposits were lost due to bank failures. That was it. And as a result of that, we ended up with the FDIC and all these big government programs. But the free market did a pretty good job during the 1930s. And the vast majority of bank deposits were safe. But today, because of the moral hazard of insured deposits and the reckless monetary policy of the Fed, the banking system is completely insolvent. And so there's only 2 possibilities. If you've got your money in a bank, there are only 2 things that could possibly happen. One is your bank fails and you lose a lot of money because the government doesn't have the money to make you whole, right? If 1 or 2 banks fail, okay, they can cover that. But if you have a major banking crisis, even a big bank, like a Bank of America or Wells Fargo, if that bank fails, just the government doesn't have the resources. The FDIC is out of money, right away. There's nothing there. So either your bank fails and you lose money. I mean, you lose deposits. You don't get 100 cents on the dollar. Or alternatively, the Federal Reserve comes to the rescue of the banks. And, okay, you get your money, but it doesn't buy very much. So either you lose your deposits or your deposits lose their value. Those are your choices. But you're not going to walk away from this whole. You're going to lose one way or another. That's why I've been advising people, you don't want to keep your money in banks. I mean, you got to keep some there because you got to pay your bills, but you don't want to keep any long-term savings there because it may not have any value. Either it's not going to be there or it's not going to buy much. So you got to withdraw it and you got to do something to protect it.
As we conclude this eye-opening exploration into the state of our banking system, it's crucial to heed Peter Schiff's warnings. Remember, the stability of our financial future rests in our hands. Consider subscribing to our channel for more insightful discussions on economics, finance, and the global markets. Together, let's navigate these uncertain waters with knowledge and preparedness. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest content. Thank you.